Welcome to the wild, forgotten land of Macedonia, where men wore capes before it was cool, and horses were practically part of the family. In this documentary, we'll take you on a ride through the dust-covered hills of northern Greece. Yes, some modern countries are still arguing about that, tracing the epic tale of a kingdom that started out as that scrappy bunch up north and ended up conquering half the known world. From its mysterious origins, strange language, and misunderstood culture to war-hardened kings and cities with names that nobody can pronounce, we'll dive deep into the land that gave birth to Alexander the Great and his unforgettable haircut. So buckle up, hit that like button, and follow the channel because things are about to get historically dramatic. Next stop, the Macedonian GPS location that confused empires for centuries. So, where exactly was Macedonia? Great question, and one that ancient empires, modern scholars, and heated internet forums still argue about. Macedonia was tucked up in the northern Balkans, just above the sophisticated city-states of classical Greece. It wasn't quite the rugged barbarian wilderness, but also not exactly Athens either. Think of it as the middle child, rougher than Sparta, but way more charming than Thrace. Its geography was a dream for military nerds. Mountains to defend, rivers to supply, and trade routes just waiting to be taxed. Controlling Macedonia meant controlling the crossroads of ancient Europe and Asia. So it's no wonder Philip II and Alexander looked at maps like kids eyeing candy. This strategic location would eventually become the launching pad for one of the most outrageous empire-building sprees the world has ever seen. But before the glory came the mud, goats, and geopolitical headaches.
So who exactly were the Macedonians? Great warriors? Backwater farmers? Secret cousins of the Greeks? Well, all of the above, depending on who you ask. The Athenians looked down on them like uninvited cousins at a toga party, calling them barbarians because they spoke a slightly different dialect and didn't recite Homer in perfect pitch. But guess what? The Macedonians didn't care. They had horses, long spears, and ambition that could move mountains and armies. Some historians argue they were a branch of northern Greeks. Others say they were a mix of Illyrians, Thracians, and who knows what from the Balkan genetic buffet. One thing's for sure, they weren't sitting around waiting for Greek approval. They were too busy building a powerhouse of their own. In the next scene, we'll dive into their odd mix of culture. Imagine wearing a Greek tunic while drinking goat milk and practicing tribal rituals. Yup, it's as wild as it sounds.
If the Macedonians were the mysterious cousins of the Greeks, then their culture was the odd dinner plate at the family reunion. Picture this, a warrior wearing a Greek-style tunic, but topped with a fur cloak and boots fit for goat chasing in the mountains. Their language? Close enough to Greek for a philosopher to raise an eyebrow, but still wild enough to confuse the poetry clubs in Athens. Macedonian rituals blended tribal vibes with Hellenic drama. Weddings included both shouting and sacrificing, sometimes the goat, sometimes the patience of the guests. And don't get us started on the hairstyles, somewhere between Greek statue and Balkan rock band. This cultural cocktail wasn't accidental. It came from centuries of living between worlds, blending the mountain toughness of the north with the sophistication of the south. In short, the Macedonians weren't trying to copy anyone. They were crafting their own brand. Wild, proud, and just a bit theatrical. Coming up next, how this colorful culture shaped their power structure. Spoiler alert, there were swords involved.
Let's talk hierarchy, because even in the goat-chasing hills of ancient Macedonia, someone had to be in charge of organizing festivals and deciding who got the biggest helmet. At the top of the pyramid sat the king, part warlord, part party host, and 100% must have a beard. Below him were the nobles, landowners, generals, and guys who could name drop their grandfather's glorious horse. These aristocrats didn't just lounge around, they led armies and schemed politely at dinner. Then came the warriors, rough, loyal, and always ready to charge into battle or into a wedding, sometimes both. And at the base, the common folk, farmers, craftsmen, and the ones who had to make everyone else's armor shine. Despite the class divisions, there was one thing everyone agreed on. Whoever held the biggest spear usually had the final say. This social structure laid the foundation for a state that could quickly transform into a war machine. Up next, what happened when all these proud tribes tried to rule themselves at the same time. Spoiler, it was messy.
Before becoming a mighty empire, Macedonia was basically a group project with zero teamwork. The land was home to a patchwork of tribes, each with their own chieftain, their own dialect, and their own idea of who should be in charge. Hint, themselves. These tribes had names that sounded like heavy metal bands: Lyncestians, Illyriotians, and Orestians, and they spent more time fighting each other than outsiders. If one tribe built a granary, another would probably try to steal the grain, or the roof. It was political chaos, Balkan style. The only thing they agreed on? Horses were sacred, feasts were mandatory, and whoever shouted loudest was clearly the most important. Enter the Argead dynasty, a royal family with enough ambition and facial hair to unite the tribes under one banner. But that's a story for another scene. For now, just know that before there was Alexander the Great, there was a lot of arguing, shouting, and occasional goat theft.
Now imagine being a Macedonian and walking into a fancy symposium in Athens. You've got your best fur cloak on, maybe even brushed your beard, and then someone hands you olives and asks if you've read Plato. Awkward. To the southern Greek city-states, Macedonians were rough around the edges. Strong, yes, but culturally, let's say, under-seasoned. The Athenians rolled their eyes. The Spartans raised an eyebrow, which is basically shouting for them. And the Thebans mostly ignored them. But under all that snobbery, the Greeks couldn't help but notice. These mountain folks were organized, ambitious, and had a habit of winning. While the Greeks squabbled over philosophy and democracy, the Macedonians were quietly building a war machine. Soon, barbarian would become boss. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's meet the cities where this uncultured power was actually cultivated. While the southern Greeks were busy naming every column and debating the perfect beard shape, the Macedonians were quietly building cities that mattered, starting with Aegae and later Pella. Aegae was the original royal seat. Think of it as the OG throne room of the Macedonian kings, complete with a tomb complex that could make Egyptian pharaohs raise an eyebrow. Ceremonies, coronations, and probably a few awkward royal weddings happened right there. But then came Pella, the new capital with actual city planning. Yes, someone finally thought of straight roads. Pella was stylish by Macedonian standards. Paved streets, courtyards, and even indoor plumbing. No more yelling across goat pens. It was also the birthplace of a certain curly-haired legend named Alexander. These cities weren't just piles of stone. They were the beating heart of a rising empire. Next, we'll explore the fuel behind it all. The fertile lands and natural riches that kept the armies marching and the goats mostly fed. Behind every great army is a very well-fed goat, or at least that's how it started in Macedonia. Before the golden armor and world domination, this land thrived thanks to something far less glamorous: agriculture. With fertile plains, gentle hills, and just enough rain to avoid praying to Zeus every Tuesday, Macedonia was a farmer's dream. Wheat, barley, grapes, olives, they had the whole Mediterranean menu. And let's not forget the livestock: goats, sheep, pigs, and of course horses, which were practically considered family members, sometimes better behaved than cousins. But the real jackpot? Resources. Iron for weapons, timber for ships, and even gold and silver mines tucked away in the hills. This earthy wealth meant one thing: they could feed, arm, and reward a growing army. So while philosophers debated ethics in Athens, Macedonians were stockpiling grain, sharpening swords, and feeding horses apples, because nothing says future empire like a fat granary and a shiny spear. For centuries, Macedonia was that quiet kid in the corner of the classroom, while Athens, Sparta, and Thebes hogged the spotlight, argued over democracy, and occasionally tried to conquer each other. To the south, Athens was writing plays and inventing philosophy. Sparta was flexing muscles and scowling at anyone who blinked. Thebes? Well, Thebes just liked picking fights. And there was Macedonia, a little rough. a little silent, but watching, taking notes, waiting, occasionally sending envoys, who were mostly ignored. But what the big players didn't see was that Macedonia was sharpening swords, building alliances, and growing stronger with every goat-fed breakfast. Sure, they weren't invited to the cool kids' symposiums, but they were preparing for something better: relevance. And when the moment came, Macedonia wouldn't just knock, they'd kick down the door. But first, let's unravel their royal origin story. And the whole descended from Heracles' PR campaign. Every good royal family needs a great origin story, and the Argeads weren't going to settle for anything less than divine blood. According to Macedonian tradition and a bit of creative PR, the Argead dynasty traced their lineage directly to Heracles. Yes, that lion-wrestling, 12-labor-completing demigod himself. Legend says their founder, Perdiccas the Firk, was a humble wanderer who followed a beam of sunlight all the way to the Macedonian throne. Convenient, right? Especially when you're trying to convince Greek elites that you're more than just a northern goat herder with ambition issues. This divine ancestry wasn't just for show, it was political power. Claiming Heracles as grandpa gave the Argeads legitimacy, prestige, and one heck of a family reunion story. And let's be honest, when your army's full of warriors and your throne is built on mythology, why not sprinkle in a little Hercules for flair? If you think Macedonians just rode horses for leisure, think again. These folks practically grew up in the saddle. In Macedonia, horses weren't just for looking majestic in parades. They were the ultimate social currency, war machines, and status symbols all rolled into one. From a young age, Macedonian boys learned to ride before they could probably pronounce Heracles. The elite cavalry, known as the companion cavalry, wasn't just a gang of horsemen. They were the rock stars of the battlefield. Sleek armor, perfectly groomed horses, and dramatic charges. They made thunder before thunder was cool. Horse culture even seeped into rituals, weddings, and, rumor has it, pickup lines. Nothing said eligible bachelor like a well-trained stallion and a shiny breastplate. This deep-rooted horse bond later became a game-changer in Alexander's conquests. Because when your soldiers can fight, ride, and pose for statues at the same time, you're doing something right. Before becoming the mastermind behind Macedonia's rise, young Philip II had quite the unusual teenage experience, being a political hostage in Thebes. But instead of moping around, Philip treated it like a study-abroad program. While other teens learned to play the lyre, he learned military formations, diplomacy, and how to outmaneuver enemies twice his size. Living among the elite Theban generals like Epaminondas, Philip observed one of the best organized armies in the Greek world. Imagine a teenage intern shadowing military legends while secretly planning his comeback. It was here he first saw the power of discipline, unity, and that glorious invention, the phalanx. While other royals collected shiny things, Philip collected strategies. And by the time he returned to Macedonia, he wasn't just a prince. He was a walking war manual waiting to be unwrapped.
When Philip II returned to Macedonia from his study abroad stint in Thebes, he didn't walk into a hero's welcome. Instead, he found a country on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The royal court was in chaos, nobles were playing Game of Thrones without the cameras, and enemy tribes were lining up at the border like it was a Black Friday sale. Oh, and let's not forget the internal civil strife, always a favorite pastime of ancient nobles. Most men would have packed their bags and considered a quiet life as a philosopher. But not Philip. With a raised eyebrow and a confident stride, he took on the mess like a man cleaning a battlefield with a toothbrush. This was his moment to shine, not by flexing muscles, but by outmaneuvering everyone with charm, wit, and a battle plan that would soon make Macedonia more than just a backwater kingdom.
Philip II didn't just want to fix Macedonia, he wanted to revolutionize it. And where better to start than with the army? Forget your grandfather's hoplites. Philip introduced something brand new, the Macedonian phalanx. Its secret weapon? The sarissa, a ridiculously long spear, so long it made enemy soldiers wonder if they were fighting a kebab skewer. With rows of disciplined soldiers holding these pikes in tight formation, It looked less like an army and more like a moving porcupine. But don't be fooled. This prickly wall was devastatingly effective. Enemies couldn't get close, and Philip's men could stab from what seemed like another zip code. This new formation turned the Macedonian army from a bar brawl into a Swiss watch of military precision. It wasn't just about sharp sticks, it was about turning foot soldiers into a synchronized machine. Thanks to the phalanx and Philip's obsession with training, Macedonia went from underdog to top dog faster than you could say strategic innovation. Philip II knew that fancy spears alone wouldn't win wars. He needed soldiers who wouldn't poke each other in the back during drills. So he rolled up his royal sleeves and turned a ragtag bunch of farmers and shepherds into a professional army. Training was no joke. Soldiers were drilled daily, marching in step, lifting sarissas, and doing synchronized shield choreography that would make a Broadway dancer weep. Discipline wasn't optional. It was a lifestyle. Miss a drill? You're running laps. Drop your spear? You're sleeping with it tonight. And these weren't just any warriors. They were paid, equipped, and held to the highest standards. Uniform gear, consistent formations, and constant practice turned the Macedonian army into a war machine that ran smoother than Philip's political speeches. By the time he was done, the peasants could fight like veterans, and Macedonia had the fiercest infantry in the ancient world, one sarissa stab at a time.
Philip II wasn't just swinging swords, he was also swinging deals. Instead of wasting soldiers on endless battles, he used a much more dangerous weapon, diplomacy. With a blend of charm, threats, and the occasional marriage proposal, Philip slowly brought neighboring tribes into the Macedonian fold. Some were flattered, some were bribed, and some just realized, better join him than get squished. His strategy of alliance and absorption turned potential enemies into loyal allies, expanding Macedonia's borders without even needing to unsheath his sarissa. By the end of his neighborly merger spree, Macedonia had doubled in size, and Philip had earned the unofficial title King of Soft Power, and occasional hard power when needed. The surrounding tribes might not have loved him, but they sure respected him, and feared what would happen if they said no. Philip II wasn't just expanding Macedonia with handshakes. Sometimes he had to roll up his sleeves and let the sarissas do the talking. The northern tribes of Illyria and Paeonia weren't interested in alliances or polite chats, so Philip launched swift campaigns to subdue them. These weren't messy, drawn-out wars. Oh no, Philip's new professional army marched like a machine, with the phalanx formation cutting through opposition like a giant comb. Within a short time, the northern frontier was secure, the borders expanded, and Philip had sent a loud message: Macedonia is not to be trifled with? This wasn't just about defense, it was a flex. Philip was showing his neighbors that diplomacy was nice, but military precision could be just as persuasive, and far more pointy. After tidying up the northern borders, Philip II turned his gaze southward, toward Thessaly. Why? Because Thessaly was like the VIP lounge of Greece, fertile, wealthy, and smack dab in the middle of everything important. But it wasn't just about land. It was about influence. By securing Thessaly, Philip gained control over key trade routes and, more importantly, political clout in Greek affairs. He didn't just send in soldiers, he sent in charm, and okay, maybe a few spears, with some clever diplomacy, a few strategic marriages, and just the right amount of "we come in peace." Unless you say no, Philip soon had Thessaly in his pocket. This move was Philip setting up his chessboard, preparing to slide Macedonia right into the heart of Greek politics, and nobody even realized they were already checkmated.
If Macedonia were the new rising power in Greece, then Athens was the grumpy old man yelling, "Back in my day!" Philip II knew Athens wasn't just any city. It was a cultural icon, a military has-been, and a diplomatic snake pit all rolled into one. But Philip, the charming troublemaker he was, decided to play the game smart. Instead of rushing in with swords drawn, he sent letters, gifts, and just the right number of troops, parked very visibly nearby. Athens, naturally suspicious, grumbled and debated, because that's what Athenians did best. Some admired Philip's strength, others feared his ambition. But no matter how much Athens huffed and puffed, Philip's influence slithered into their politics like an oily eel in a toga. It was less of a war, more of a very tense chess match, one where Philip kept whispering, "Check, not mate, yet." The Battle of Cheronea wasn't just another brawl. It was Philip II's grand finale in the Greek unification tour. Facing a coalition of Athens and Thebes, who finally agreed on something, Philip led the charge with his upgraded Macedonian army. But the real MVP? His teenage son, Alexander, who wasn't just tagging along for fun. He commanded a cavalry wing and broke the enemy's line like a lightning bolt in a toga. The Greeks fought fiercely, but the Macedonian phalanx, with those absurdly long sarissas, mowed through like wheat in harvest season. By sunset, Philip stood victorious. Athens was humbled, Thebes was stunned, and Greece was suddenly very quiet. Philip didn't just win a battle. He ended centuries of Greek squabbling with a giant metaphorical "enough already" and a very real army behind it. After uniting almost all of Greece, with only minor grumbling from the usual suspects, Philip II came up with a plan so audacious it could only have come from someone who'd already conquered boredom. Invade Persia. That's right. Philip wanted to take the Macedonian show on the road, across the Aegean, and into the heart of the mighty Persian Empire. He pitched the idea to the Greek city-states as a pan-Hellenic revenge tour for Persia's past invasions. The Greeks, still sore about that whole burning Athens thing, kind of bought it. Philip started organizing the logistics, ships, supply chains, epic speeches, and of course, a let's make nice summit with the Greek states. Everything was coming together beautifully until it wasn't. As fate and drama would have it, Philip never made it to Persia. His dream would be left for someone else to fulfill, a certain young man named Alexander. Behind the armor and war maps, Philip II's personal life was a battlefield of its own. With more marriages than most could remember, and certainly more than his advisors could manage, Philip used weddings like modern rulers use treaties. One wife brought an alliance with a northern tribe, another came with a dowry of useful territory, and yet another, well, no one's quite sure why she was there. The palace turned into a real-life soap opera, complete with jealous queens, ambitious in-laws, and endless gossip. Courtiers tiptoed through the halls like diplomats avoiding war zones. Meanwhile, Philip navigated these domestic storms with the same cunning he used on the battlefield, although sometimes even he lost count of who was mad at whom. Of course, all these entanglements weren't just for love, although he was famously charming. They were part of a long game of power, unity, and just a pinch of chaos. Marriage politics, Macedonian style. As young Alexander grew into a proud, sharp-minded prince, his relationship with Philip II turned into a royal version of a reality show. Tense standoffs, dramatic exits, and intense father-son debates over dinner. Philip, the master planner, saw Alexander as a talented but impatient student. Alexander, on the other hand, believed he was destined for greatness and didn't enjoy being overshadowed by Dad's endless triumphs and many weddings. Add in Olympias, Alexander's fiercely protective mother who wasn't exactly besties with Philip, and the royal household had more tension than a siege tower under pressure. While they admired each other's brilliance, trust was as fragile as Philip's wine goblets during an argument. Their rivalry wasn't just about strategy, it was about legacy. Would Philip allow his son to shine, or was Macedonia only big enough for one genius? The answer, as history showed, was complicated.
The grand wedding of Philip II's daughter was meant to be a dazzling celebration of power, unity, and glittery outfits. Dignitaries, nobles, and even some old rivals were in attendance. But in true Macedonian fashion, where no party is complete without a hint of political tension, drama struck hard. As Philip, proudly strutting down the aisle to greet the crowd, he was suddenly stabbed by one of his own bodyguards, Pausanias, right in the middle of the festivities. The scene turned from royal cheer to royal chaos in seconds. Rumors flew faster than sarissas. Was it a personal vendetta? A conspiracy from within the court? Did Olympias or even Alexander know more than they let on? The assassin didn't live long enough to talk. He was conveniently chased down and killed. Philip, the builder of the empire, died not on a battlefield, but at a wedding. Classic twist, really.
Even after his untimely and dramatic end, Philip II's legacy loomed larger than a sarissa at a family dinner. This was no ordinary king. He turned a chaotic patch of squabbling tribes into a disciplined war machine with matching outfits and synchronized stomping. His military genius wasn't just in creating the fearsome Macedonian phalanx, but also in uniting Greece, not through hugs, but through strategy, politics, and occasionally intimidation with really long spears. He redefined statecraft, military organization, and left behind a kingdom that was not only powerful, but ready for global conquest. His son, Alexander, would inherit a polished empire with neatly labeled files, full war chests, and well-fed soldiers. Without Philip's groundwork, there would be no Alexander the Great, just Alexander the slightly ambitious. Philip's name might not get as many statues, but historians and dads everywhere know who really laid the bricks.
Long before he became the world's most famous conqueror, Alexander was just a curious boy, with a sharp mind, an oversized ego, and a tutor named Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle. While other kids played with sticks, Alexander debated metaphysics and plotted imaginary invasions. Aristotle filled his head with philosophy, ethics, biology, and just enough moral ambiguity to make him dangerous. Young Alex also had front-row seats to his father's military campaigns and royal drama, turning him into a hybrid of philosopher and aspiring warlord. His pet project? Taming Bucephalus, a horse so wild even the royal stablemaster gave up. But not our boy. Alexander simply whispered sweet nothings into the horse's ear and used a smart shadow trick, and boom, new best friend and battle companion for life. The palace buzzed with gossip. This kid's either a genius or a lunatic. Spoiler alert, he was both. If someone had tried to build a hero from scratch, they probably would have ended up with someone like Alexander. He had the sharp brain of a philosopher, the fiery heart of a warrior, and just enough arrogance to fill a stadium. His charisma, off the charts. His confidence, borderline cosmic. While others were planning dinner, Alexander was planning world domination, ideally before dessert. He debated ideas with Aristotle in the morning and practiced stabbing straw dummies in the afternoon. His peers either admired him, feared him, or just tried to stay out of his way. As a teenager, he believed glory was a birthright, and fate owed him a chapter in every history book. Of course, he wasn't just muscle and monologue. He actually listened, learned, and led with uncanny precision. The perfect mix of brain, brawn, and bring it on, Alexander was already more than a prince. He was a storm waiting for a battlefield. At just 20 years old, Alexander suddenly found himself wearing the crown, and it wasn't a comfy fit. His father, Philip II, had just been assassinated, and instead of a peaceful coronation, Alexander got a royal welcome of rebellions, rival claims, and nobles with daggers hidden in their togas. But Alexander didn't flinch. With one eyebrow raised and a sword in hand, he declared himself king, stared down the doubters, and began what can only be described as a full-speed political cleanup. He executed a few troublemakers, the ancient version of unfriending, tamed the rowdy nobles, and reminded Greece that the son of Philip didn't come to play. While other 20-year-olds were figuring out how to pay rent, Alexander was crushing conspiracies before breakfast. In just months, he turned chaos into order, sat firmly on the throne, and set his sights on Persia. Spoiler alert, this was only the warm-up. Thebes, once proud and rebellious, thought Alexander was just a young prince playing king. Big mistake. When the city rose in rebellion, Alexander didn't send messengers. He sent himself, and 30,000 soldiers with a very clear message: don't mess with Macedonia. In a flash, his army stormed the walls, crushed resistance, and turned Thebes into rubble. It wasn't just a battle. It was a masterclass in shock and awe. Temples collapsed, statues toppled, and surviving rebels were either sold, silenced, or very, very sorry. But this wasn't just destruction. It was a warning. Thebes became the ancient world's cautionary tale: resist Alexander, and your postal code gets erased. The rest of Greece got the memo loud and clear. From Athens to Sparta, leaders suddenly discovered a new hobby: praising young Alexander. The boy king was no longer just Philip's son. He was a force of nature, and nature had a temper. After flattening Thebes and leaving the Greek world in silent awe, Alexander turned his gaze eastward. Persia, the land of gold, spices, and a king who thought he was invincible. Alexander saw it as both a challenge and a legacy. This wasn't just about war. It was about fulfilling his father Philip's unfinished dream, conquering the greatest empire of the time. So he gathered his generals, polished his armor, twice for good luck, and made a to-do list. 1. Cross the Hellespont. 2. Beat the Persians. 3. Become legendary. Easy, right? Preparations were meticulous. Troop formations, supply routes, dramatic speeches to boost morale, and intimidate any doubters. Aristotle's teachings were packed away, replaced by maps, siege weapons, and horse grooming kits. The entire army marched like a theater troupe, ready for the biggest play of their lives. Alexander didn't just want to win battles, he wanted to change the world, and preferably look great while doing it. The Granicus River wasn't just a picturesque stream, it was Alexander's first major battlefield against the Persians. As he and his troops approached, his generals advised waiting until morning. But Alexander, being Alexander, saw that as too boring. So he charged straight in, with full armor, a dramatic yell, and probably a very confused horse. The Persian satraps, lounging on the other side, were caught mid-snack. What followed was pure chaos: water splashing, horses neighing, spears flying like angry bees. Alexander fought at the front lines, of course, because leading from the back was simply not stylish enough. He took a sword hit to the helmet, thankfully just a scratch on his pride. By sunset, the Macedonians had won, the Persians were scattered, and Alexander had made a very loud announcement to Asia: "I'm here, I'm fabulous, and I'm not leaving anytime soon." The Battle of Issus was less about who had more troops and more about who had the bigger ego. On one side, Alexander riding high on his Granicus victory and a sense of invincibility. On the other, Darius III, king of Persia, bringing an army so massive it needed its own zip code. But numbers aren't everything, especially when the battlefield is so narrow your elephants have to queue in single file. Alexander saw the bottleneck and smiled. What followed was a classic slice-and-dice maneuver. While Darius tried to command from the back, like a wise manager, Alexander went full action hero, slicing through the front lines until he almost reached Darius himself. The Persian king, understandably panicked, fled, leaving behind not only his army but also his mom, wife, and daughters. Alexander, ever the gentleman, treated them with royal respect, though their awkward dinner conversation must have been something. Victory at Issus wasn't just military. It was PR gold. Alexander wasn't just a conqueror now, he was a brand.
Tyre was not just any city. It was the ancient equivalent of a fortress on steroids, surrounded by water and arrogance. When Alexander showed up and politely asked for access to their temple, the Tyrians replied with a diplomatic nope and a metaphorical door slam. But Alexander didn't rage. He rolled up his sleeves and got creative. Since the city was an island, he ordered a causeway to be built across the sea, stone by stone, like a very angry toddler playing with blocks. The Tyrians responded with fire ships and arrows, turning the construction site into a splashy battlefield. Still, after 7 relentless months and several frustrating setbacks, including a few engineers being overly optimistic, the causeway was complete. Alexander's army stormed the city like it was the finale of a siege-themed reality show. The result? Tyre fell spectacularly. The message? Don't say no to a guy who can move the sea. The siege of Tyre wasn't just a military feat, it was a monument to sheer determination and a reminder: Alexander doesn't do impossible.
After flattening Tyre and dazzling the region with his engineering stubbornness, Alexander marched into Egypt, not as a conqueror, but more like a long-lost celebrity returning home. The Egyptians, tired of Persian rule, basically rolled out the red carpet, the golden papyrus scroll, and probably a few cats for good measure. They declared Alexander a living god, the new son of Amun-Ra. Alexander, never one to shy away from divine PR, graciously accepted and made a divine pit stop to the Oracle of Siwa in the desert. because even conquerors need a little cosmic validation. Legend has it, the oracle whispered something mysterious, and Alexander walked out convinced he was, in fact, divine. Not bad for a guy in his 20s. To seal the deal, he founded a city, Alexandria, because naming cities after yourself was totally in vogue. It would become one of the greatest centers of learning and culture in the ancient world. So yes, Alexander came, saw, got deified, and did some urban planning on the side, as one does.
If you thought Alexander had peaked after founding Alexandria and being declared a god, think again. Enter the Battle of Gaugamela. It wasn't just a battle, it was Alexander's ultimate boss fight. Darius III, now extra salty after losing at Issus, came back with a mega army that could have filled a football stadium. Twice. Alexander? He brought strategy, confidence, and the ability to ride a horse like he was born in the saddle. With clever formations, a feigned retreat here, a surprise flank there, Alexander cracked open the Persian ranks like a walnut. Darius, again, fled the scene, starting to look like a habit. The victory at Gaugamela wasn't just a win, it was a historical mic drop. The Persian Empire, which had loomed over the known world for centuries, crumbled like a stale cookie. Alexander, at not even 30, now ruled from the Aegean Sea to the edge of Central Asia. The message was clear. This wasn't just conquest, it was destiny in action. And the best part? He still had more maps to color in.
Fresh off his epic win at Gaugamela, Alexander marched into Babylon like he was checking into a 5-star resort, minus the room service, but with a fanfare of trumpets. The city, a jewel of Mesopotamia, opened its gates with more enthusiasm than a modern-day flash mob. The locals cheering, the nobles offering gifts, the priests probably wondering if he was yet another god to add to their list. And the treasury? Let's just say Alexander hit the jackpot. Gold, silver, jewels, enough to make a dragon blush. With all this wealth, he didn't just throw victory parties, he upgraded his entire empire's lifestyle. But Alexander wasn't there just to roll in gold like Scrooge McDuck. He began reorganizing administration, blending Greek and Persian customs like a cultural smoothie. Babylon became his new power base, a symbol of his ambition to rule not just with force but with flair. At this point, Alexander wasn't just a conqueror. He was a rock-star emperor with a plan, a treasury full of bling, and the world literally at his feet.
Having conquered the Persian Empire like it was a weekend hobby, Alexander turned his eyes eastward, to India, a land so mysterious that even his cartographers had written, "Here be elephants." The march was no picnic. Tropical rains, unfamiliar terrain, and bugs the size of small helmets challenged even the hardiest Macedonian. And then came the elephants. Massive, majestic, and terrifying, these war beasts made even seasoned cavalry pause mid-charge. But Alexander, ever the drama king, saw this as the perfect stage for his next act. He rallied his men with a speech so fiery it could dry socks, reminding them they weren't just soldiers, they were history makers. With fanfare, flair, and probably a bit of "we've come this far, might as well," the army crossed into India. For Alexander, it wasn't just about conquering new lands. It was about pushing boundaries, geographical, psychological, and sartorial. Those tropical tunics were breezy. What lay ahead was unknown, but one thing was certain. Elephants or not, he wasn't turning back yet.
The Battle of the Hydaspes was less a clash and more a colossal mud wrestling match, with elephants. Facing King Porus and his massive war elephants, Alexander's troops were soaked, exhausted, and possibly questioning their life choices. But retreat? Never. Alexander, dripping wet and dramatically windswept as always, devised a clever river-crossing tactic under the cover of rain and darkness. His army struck from an unexpected angle, catching the Indian forces off guard. The battle was brutal. Arrows flew, horses slipped, and elephants rampaged in all directions, confused and terrified. Amidst the chaos, Alexander personally engaged Porus, who turned out to be a worthy adversary, tall, noble, and stubborn as a stone wall. In the end, Alexander won the battle, but not without cost. His troops were battered, bruised, and beginning to ask, "Are we done yet?" The victory was glorious, yes, but it also planted the first seeds of war weariness among his men, who were starting to think that maybe, just maybe, conquering the whole world was a bit much. After the brutal battle at the Hydaspes River, Alexander's army looked less like conquerors and more like survivors of a very muddy obstacle course. Wounded, homesick, and increasingly skeptical about their fearless leader's global domination agenda, the soldiers gathered their courage, not for another battle, but to say no to Alexander. And for once, Alexander had to listen. His men, the same warriors who crossed deserts and mountains without complaint, finally put their sandal-covered feet down. Alexander tried everything: motivational speeches, glorious visions, even promises of rest days, which no one believed. But the army stood firm. With a dramatic sigh and a heroic hair flip, Alexander reluctantly agreed to turn back. It wasn't defeat. It was strategic reorientation. Thus began the long, winding journey home. The great conqueror who had never lost a battle now faced his first real challenge, dealing with a grumpy, travel-weary army who just wanted a hot meal, dry boots, and maybe a vacation, preferably without elephants. Back in Babylon, Alexander was no longer charging into battle, but charging into city planning meetings. With dreams of uniting East and West, he envisioned new cities, new roads, and perhaps even a world tour of Alexander-themed souvenirs. But while the conqueror drew up grand plans, his body began sending subtle and not so subtle reminders that even demigods need rest. Fever, fatigue, and whispers of poisoning swirled through the palace. Was it malaria? Was it betrayal? Or was it simply the result of a decade of overachieving without sleep? No one knows for sure. What we do know is that at the age of 32, the man who had never lost a battle finally lost a fight. This time, to fate. His generals wept, his soldiers panicked, and the empire he built in record time was suddenly without its engine. Alexander the Great died as suddenly as he had risen, dramatically, mysteriously, and with at least one eyebrow raised from the gods. It began like a common cold, a little fatigue, a little fever. But when you're Alexander the Great, even getting sick becomes a historical event. One day he was planning new cities, the next he was confined to bed, surrounded by anxious generals. Rumors buzzed louder than flies in Babylon. Had someone poisoned him? Or was it just a bad case of royal burnout? The palace transformed into a hospital meets panic room. Doctors, priests, and worried aides all offered their own remedies, some involving herbs, others involving prayers, and at least one involving a goat, don't ask. Despite their best efforts and a few questionable concoctions, Alexander's condition worsened. He lost his voice, his strength, and finally the ability to command. The most powerful man in the world lay helpless, and no one could explain why. Thus began not only his final illness, but also the first chapter of one of history's most enduring mysteries. After Alexander fell ill, Babylon buzzed like a marketplace of conspiracy theories. Was it malaria from some mosquito with delusions of grandeur? Typhoid from dodgy river water? Or did someone sneak poison into his wine? Some said it was revenge from Persian loyalists. Others whispered that jealous generals wanted his crown early. Even his endless drinking parties were blamed. Turns out drink like a god has limits. The palace halls echoed with debates between healers, gossiping servants, and amateur detectives in armor. There was no CSI Babylon, so theories multiplied like Macedonian colonies. To this day, historians still argue, each theory with its own loyal fans. Some prefer death by fever, others root for murder mystery. One thing's certain, Alexander's death was as dramatic, confusing, and over-the-top as his life. He might have left the world, but he left behind a riddle worthy of a Netflix docuseries. As Alexander lay on his deathbed, surrounded by generals, scholars, and probably a few nosy palace maids pretending to dust, everyone had one burning question. So, who's next? But Alexander, ever the showman, left them with just 4 words: to the strongest. a phrase so vague it could have launched 1,000 wars. Spoiler, it did. Was it wisdom, a prank, or just delirium from high fever? No one knew. The room fell into a stunned silence, followed by immediate chaos. Generals glanced at each other like kids eyeing the last slice of cake. Except this cake was a vast empire. With no official heir, no backup plan, and way too many overconfident egos, the stage was set for power struggles worthy of a reality show. Alexander exited the stage, but the drama was just beginning.
After Alexander's dramatic final words, "To the strongest," the real circus began. His top generals, each convinced that strongest obviously meant them, quickly went from mourning to maneuvering. What followed was less a dignified succession and more a royal free-for-all. Imagine a strategy board game played by egomaniacs with armies. Ptolemy grabbed Egypt like someone calling dibs on the best slice of cake. Seleucus fancied the east. Antigonus, Cassander, and Lysimachus all staked their claims, and suddenly the Macedonian court turned into an ancient version of reality TV. Game of Thrones, Spear Edition. Alliances formed and broke faster than a Spartan's temper. Each general raised armies, gave grand speeches about unity, then promptly invaded each other's territories. And thus, the wars of the successors began, not so much to preserve Alexander's legacy, but to see who could wear his shiny boots the longest.
Alexander the Great had barely cooled down when a new battlefield emerged. Not for his empire, but for his body. His generals, already bickering over territories, now argued over funeral arrangements like a dysfunctional family at a wedding. Some insisted his remains must return to Macedonia, the land of his birth. Others, especially Ptolemy, had a shinier idea: bring Alexander's mummy to Egypt and turn it into a symbol of legitimacy. While debates heated up, Ptolemy skipped the drama and intercepted the funeral procession en route, like someone stealing a celebrity's hearse. He rerouted the grand sarcophagus straight to Memphis and later to Alexandria, building a lavish tomb. Macedonia never even saw the casket. Thus, Alexander's corpse went on a road trip more dramatic than any military campaign he ever led. And Ptolemy? He got the bonus of being seen as heir by corpse. Talk about strategic embalming. With Alexander gone and his sarcophagus comfortably parked in Egypt, the empire faced its next big dilemma. Who gets what? Since Alexander's last will was basically a cryptic "to the strongest," his top generals interpreted it as a divine invitation to play a violent game of Monopoly. They sliced up the empire like an oversized wedding cake. Ptolemy grabbed Egypt. He already had the body, might as well take the land. Seleucus took the vast eastern territories stretching to India, which sounded great until you realized the neighbors weren't exactly friendly. Antigonus got Asia Minor, Cassander took Macedonia, and Lysimachus, well, he got Thrace. Yay? Each thought they got the best deal, and none realized they had just signed up for decades of drama, betrayal, and the kind of family feuds that would make soap operas blush. Welcome to the age of the Diadochi, the original real generals of Macedon. So now each general had his piece of Alexander's empire, and a giant headache to go with it. Turns out ruling a multicultural, multilingual, mega-sized patchwork of territories wasn't as easy as it looked on the conquest map. From Persia to Egypt, everyone had different gods, customs, and a very low tolerance for being ruled by a bunch of squabbling Macedonians. Civil wars broke out faster than you could say Diadochi, and alliances changed more often than royal hairstyles. The generals who once shared toasts over victory now shared insults and javelins. Antigonus started calling himself king. Cassander rolled his eyes. Seleucus fortified everything, including his breakfast. And Ptolemy, he stayed cozy in Egypt, polishing Alexander's sarcophagus and pretending not to hear the chaos outside. The dream of a unified empire shattered like a dropped amphora, and the age of endless wars officially began. Spoiler alert, it gets messy. Though Alexander's empire fractured faster than a dropped clay pot, something unexpected took root in the chaos. Hellenization. Greek culture, language, philosophy, and even gym memberships began spreading across the east like a well-seasoned hummus. From the markets of Egypt to the mountains of Bactria, locals found themselves debating Plato over pita and yelling "Eureka" in thick regional accents. The generals may have squabbled, but they all agreed that Greek art, architecture, and drama made them look sophisticated in front of the locals. Cities with Greek-style theaters and temples popped up everywhere, like a cultural franchise expansion. Suddenly, Persian nobles were wearing togas, and Indian coins bore inscriptions in Greek. It wasn't world domination anymore. It was world influence, in sandals and olive oil. Even after the wars, the dream of a united world didn't die. It just got a Greek accent.
Though Alexander died young, his legacy aged like fine wine, powerful, bold, and occasionally intoxicating. His military tactics became textbook material for every general who fancied themselves the next big thing. Want to outflank your enemy? Ask Alexander. Want to found a city that still exists centuries later? Again, Alexander. He didn't just conquer lands. He left behind a network of cities, many of them named after himself. Humility clearly wasn't his thing. These cities became hubs of learning, trade, and art. Greek architecture popped up from Egypt to India like a stylish brand expansion. His idea of blending cultures, called fusion cuisine today, helped shape the multicultural fabric of future empires. And don't even get us started on his influence in military training, civic planning, and haircuts. Seriously, the man knew how to pose on a coin. For a guy who passed away at 32, Alexander's resume remained active for centuries.
Alexander the Great may have left this world at 32, but he never truly exited the stage of history. His legend outgrew the man himself, turning a mortal king into a symbol of ambition, curiosity, and East-West connection. From dusty classrooms to Hollywood movies, his name still gets more screen time than many modern rulers. Was he a genius, a megalomaniac, a philosophical conqueror? The answer is probably yes to all. His dream of uniting the world under one vision, while slightly impractical, sparked a cultural chain reaction that reshaped continents. And despite all the chaos after his death, his ghost seemed to linger in every city he built, every general he trained, and every ambitious soul who tried to follow in his sandals. Alexander wasn't just a king. He became history's rock star, with a legacy that marched far beyond the maps he once redrew. With Alexander gone and no clear heir, unless you count the strongest as a solid will, his generals, now known as the Diadochi, decided to turn the funeral into a board meeting. Each one grabbed a slice of the empire as if it were a giant baklava. Ptolemy said, "I'll take Egypt." Seleucus nodded. "Middle East sounds nice." Cassander grumbled, "Guess I'll settle for Greece." And so began a decades-long game of Risk, Ancient Edition. No one trusted anyone. Everyone had ambitions, and alliances lasted about as long as a cup of watered-down wine. Instead of unity, we got civil wars, assassinations, and enough backstabbing to make a Greek tragedy look cheerful. Yet somehow, amidst all the chaos, a new era was born. The Hellenistic world. Who knew world domination could be so democratic?
After a long game of who gets what among Alexander's generals, Seleucus emerged as one of the luckiest, or at least most patient players. Following several civil wars and backstabbing episodes worthy of a soap opera, Seleucus carved out a kingdom that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus. Welcome to the Seleucid Empire, the ancient version of too big to rule. With cities named after himself, because modesty was so 4th century BC, Seleucus tried to blend Greek administration with local customs. It was a bold experiment in multicultural chaos. Persian nobles, Greek settlers, local rebellions. It was like trying to host a dinner party where no one liked the menu. Still, the empire became a major hub for trade, learning, and the occasional riot. Seleucus may not have reunited Alexander's dream, but he definitely left a colorful mark on the map.
While others fought tooth and nail for chunks of Alexander's shattered empire, Ptolemy took a different approach. He went south. Claiming Egypt like a vacation home with great real estate, Ptolemy built the Ptolemaic dynasty, which would rule for nearly 300 years. Talk about long-term investment. He made Alexandria the crown jewel, a city of marble, scrolls, philosophers, and the occasional camel traffic jam. Ptolemy mixed Greek rule with Egyptian flair, even declaring himself pharaoh. Because why not? Temples to Greek gods stood beside pyramids, and royal statues sported both togas and false beards. The result? A unique hybrid culture where Plato met the Nile. While his cousins up north were busy stabbing each other in council meetings, Ptolemy was building libraries and collecting obelisks. Cleopatra, the most famous Ptolemaic descendant, would one day carry this quirky blend of cultures into her own dramatic spotlight. But it all began with Ptolemy, the general who said, "Let them fight, I'll take the pyramids." While Ptolemy was building libraries and Seleucus was building empires, Antigonus had a different dream, rebuilding Alexander's whole empire from scratch. Ambitious? Yes. Realistic? Not quite. Antigonus, a grizzled veteran with a commanding glare and one working eye, the other lost to battle, not bad aim, rallied troops, seized territories, and tried to boss around the other Diadochi like a strict substitute teacher. He declared himself king before it was trendy, and even dragged his son Demetrius into the business. Together, they gave the others serious heartburn. But dreams of empire don't come cheap. A coalition of rivals, Seleucus, Ptolemy, Cassander, and Lysimachus, teamed up for a classic group project against the loudest guy in class. The final showdown came at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE, where Antigonus lost not just his dream, but also his life. His empire crumbled before it was fully built, and from the ashes rose, well, 5 separate kingdoms with 5 separate egos. So much for unity.
After the fall of Antigonus, the Antigonid family didn't pack their bags and leave quietly. Nope. They regrouped and said, "Well, if we can't have it all, we'll just keep Macedonia." And that's exactly what they did. The Antigonid dynasty took root in the rugged hills of Macedonia, holding on to the homeland like a cat with its favorite pillow. Demetrius, son of Antigonus, kicked things off, followed by his descendants, who managed to stay relevant in the ever-chaotic game of thrones. They turned Macedonia into a Balkan powerhouse, albeit a noisy one, constantly clashing with Greek city-states and eventually the Romans. Their strategy? Mix old-school Macedonian might with just enough Greek flair to impress the neighbors. They weren't trying to conquer the world anymore, just survive with dignity and a solid beard game. Though no longer the center of the universe, Macedonia remained a thorn in the side of every Mediterranean superpower, until Rome showed up with a bigger stick. While the successors of Alexander were busy slicing the empire like a birthday cake, Cassander decided to keep things tidy in Greece by turning into the grumpiest housekeeper in history. Son of Antipater and no fan of democracy, Cassander ruled with the subtlety of a hammer. He rebuilt Thebes to score political points and maybe some forgiveness from the ghosts of the past. But his true skill was keeping Greek city-states from tearing each other apart, barely. His rule wasn't warm or inspiring, but it worked, for a while. The Greek cities, exhausted from years of chaos and short-term rulers, tolerated Cassander's tough love. Of course, this peace came with side effects: censorship, paranoia, and an occasional disappearance of rivals. All in all, Cassander was like a strict uncle at a family reunion. No fun, lots of rules, but at least no one threw a plate for a few years.
Lysimachus, once Alexander's loyal bodyguard, now fancied himself a kingmaker, or just a regular king. After grabbing Thrace and parts of Asia Minor like someone sweeping the leftovers after a party, he thought he had it made. With ambitions higher than Mount Olympus and a suspiciously sharp smile, Lysimachus tried to play both diplomat and warlord. He built cities, minted coins with his own face because modesty is overrated, and married into power like it was a sport. But there was one tiny problem. His shiny new empire was surrounded by bigger, meaner Diadochi. Seleucids on one side, Antigonids on the other, and no shortage of betrayals in between. Spoiler alert! Lysimachus eventually met his end not in glory, but in a betrayal-filled mess that even Greek tragedies would find dramatic. His kingdom? Picked apart like a cheese platter at a royal feast.
The Diadochi Wars. Basically a decades-long family feud, but with more swords, backstabbing, and dramatically flung cloaks. After Alexander's death, his generals couldn't agree on who should rule the empire, so they all decided to try ruling it themselves. The result? Endless alliances, betrayals, and battles with names no one could pronounce. Antigonus wanted it all. Seleucus wanted the east. Ptolemy held on to Egypt like a cat clutching a fish. And Cassander just wanted people to stop yelling. The wars were chaotic enough to make a Greek playwright weep. Nobody truly won, unless you count aging poorly, losing friends, or being assassinated as victory. But despite the mess, these wars carved out the map of the Hellenistic world and laid the groundwork for centuries of cultural fusion. Not bad for a bunch of angry ex-co-workers with spears.
Despite all the sword-swinging, crown-grabbing, and empire-splitting chaos, one thing survived. Greek culture, like a very determined tourist, it spread everywhere. The Hellenistic era was less about conquering and more about cultural exporting, with philosophers, architects, and gym owners popping up from Babylon to Bactria. Greek temples were built next to Zoroastrian fire altars. Locals in Afghanistan were suddenly quoting Plato, probably mispronounced. Even city planning got a Greek makeover, complete with theaters and colonnades. And let's not forget the language. Koine Greek became the international lingo of diplomacy, philosophy, and drama, basically the ancient version of English with togas. While the generals fought for territory, Greek culture quietly moved in and redecorated. The East didn't just get invaded, it got Hellenized, with a dash of drama, a hint of tragedy, and a lot of marble.
If someone told you there was a Greek kingdom nestled between Persia and India, you'd probably squint and ask, seriously? But Bactria was very real, and very Greek. Imagine philosophers in sandals wandering around desert towns, locals debating Aristotle over naan, and gymnasiums, where people exercised while dodging sandstorms. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom, founded by breakaway governors from the Seleucid Empire, lasted nearly 2 centuries. An impressive feat considering their neighbors weren't exactly sending over baklava. The rulers built cities with Greek temples and theaters, minted coins with Zeus on one side and elephants on the other, and made fusion cuisine look like an ancient innovation. It was a strange yet delightful blend. Part Sparta, part Silk Road. Bactria may have been far from Athens, but its heart beat with Hellenistic rhythm. Dusty, philosophical, and stubbornly cultured. If the ancient world had a brain, it was Alexandria. This wasn't just a city, it was a mega library, a think tank, and a multicultural cafe rolled into one. Founded by Alexander the Great, but really built up by the Ptolemies, Alexandria became the beating intellectual heart of the Hellenistic world. At its center stood the Great Library, a place where scrolls outnumbered people, and scholars debated everything from the shape of Earth to why cats act like tiny emperors. Scientists like Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference, while others attempted to measure the stars, using tools that looked suspiciously like fancy ladles. Philosophers, poets, and mathematicians gathered here, sipping watered wine while complaining about Plato being overrated. Alexandria was the nerd capital of antiquity, bright, brilliant, and a little bit chaotic. And while the library itself may have eventually burned down, its legacy still smolders in every modern university, minus the togas.
And then came Cleopatra. Not just any Cleopatra, but the Cleopatra. The last of the Ptolemaic line, last queen of Hellenistic Egypt, and the final chapter of Macedonian royalty with enough charisma to rival Alexander himself. Fluent in several languages, sharp as a tack, and fully aware of how eyeliner could double as political strategy, Cleopatra knew how to keep Rome on its toes. She charmed Julius Caesar, outmaneuvered rivals, and tried to play Rome like a liar. But even the most glamorous strategy has its limits. When her alliance with Mark Antony turned into a romantic drama worthy of Netflix, things took a fatal turn. After a crushing defeat by Octavian, future Emperor Augustus, Cleopatra chose the dramatic exit, legend says by snakebite, because apparently overdosing on flair was a royal tradition. With her death, the age of Greek queens ended, the Roman Empire began, and Egypt lost its final link to the Macedonian dream.
Even though the successor kingdoms fought like cats in a sack, they accidentally became ambassadors of Greek culture. While generals squabbled over borders, philosophers, architects, and merchants were busy spreading Hellenistic vibes from the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush. People in places that couldn't even spell Athens were suddenly debating Stoicism over kebabs. The Seleucids brought columns and comedies to Persia. The Ptolemies sprinkled Greek words over Egyptian temples, and the Antigonids taught Balkan folks how to do dramatic theatre exits. Greek-style gymnasiums popped up in cities no Greek had ever heard of, and Apollo statues watched over bazaars buzzing with Persian spices. Ironically, Alexander's dream of cultural unity wasn't realized through one empire, but through a dozen noisy, chaotic ones. So while the kings flexed their egos, the real winners were sandals, marble, and the Greek alphabet, now etched in places even Alexander never reached.
The Hellenistic era wasn't just an after-party of Alexander's empire, it was a full-blown cultural remix. Greek ideas, language, architecture, and fashion fused with Persian spices, Egyptian rituals, and Indian elephants. Philosophers debated under palm trees while gymnasiums popped up next to ziggurats. The East met West, often over a platter of olives and curry. Though the successor kings were too busy out-dramaing each other to notice, they laid the groundwork for something big. Rome. That's right. While the Greeks were arguing about who wore the best toga, the Romans were taking notes. The Romans would eventually swoop in, inherit this blended world, and slap their own Latin labels on it. But make no mistake, the Hellenistic period was the real cultural MVP, proving once again that chaos, ego, and a touch of philosophy can accidentally shape civilization. And so, from Alexander's ashes rose not just kingdoms, but a blueprint for empire building that would echo for centuries.
Before guns, drones, and tactical nukes, there was the Macedonian phalanx. It wasn't flashy, but it was a nightmare to fight against. Imagine a wall of angry farmers with 6-meter-long spears called sarissas, all moving in perfect sync like a spiky centipede. Philip II, Alexander's dad, didn't just invent a formation, he invented a war-winning rhythm. The first 5 rows would stab forward, the rest acted like traffic cones with attitude. This hedgehog of doom was nearly impossible to penetrate. When Alexander inherited it, he just added some flair, like high-speed flanking cavalry and a dramatic soundtrack. Okay, maybe not the music. Enemies quickly learned that running straight at a Macedonian wall of spears was like trying to hug a porcupine, with less success. The phalanx wasn't just a formation, it was a cultural weapon, showing how discipline and geometry could stomp chaos into submission. Math had never been so pointy.
Behind every fearsome phalanx was relentless training. Macedonian soldiers weren't born disciplined. They were forged like bronze, hammered daily under the sun by drill sergeants who could yell louder than thunder. Marching in sync wasn't optional. It was survival. Drop your sarissa, 10 push-ups, step out of line, run a lap, in full armor, laugh during formation. Congratulations, you're now on latrine duty for a week. But beneath the sweat and sarcasm lay a bond stronger than iron. Soldiers trained, ate, and bled together, turning into a synchronized war machine that could pivot mid-battle like dancers in a blood-soaked ballet. Alexander didn't just command soldiers. He led a brotherhood honed through discipline, repetition, and the occasional bruised ego. It was this unity that allowed them to march across deserts, scale mountains, and still have enough energy to conquer cities before lunch. In the Macedonian army, teamwork wasn't a motivational poster. It was how you stayed alive.
While the phalanx may have been the superstar of the battlefield, it definitely didn't fight alone. Behind every sturdy shield wall was a full cast of military sidekicks ready to shine. Enter the cavalry, swift, stylish, and usually the ones to steal the glory with a dramatic charge at the enemy's flanks. Then came the archers, whose job was to look cool while launching death from a distance, often with suspicious accuracy. And let's not forget the mercenaries, fierce warriors from foreign lands who didn't care who won as long as they got paid and maybe got to keep a shiny helmet. Alexander's genius lay in knowing how to blend all these parts into one seamless war machine. Think Avengers, but with more facial hair and fewer capes. Each unit had its role, and together they created a ballet of battle, gritty, chaotic, and oddly choreographed. The result? An army that didn't just march, it performed.
Alexander may have had divine ambitions, but even he knew one cannot conquer the known world without some serious help. Enter his trusted generals, a band of sharp minds and even sharper swords. These weren't just glorified assistants carrying maps. They were the tactical brains behind the brawn. Parmenion, the seasoned veteran who occasionally raised an eyebrow at Alexander's wild plans, but still got the job done. Hephaestion, the loyal bestie who made sure everything ran like a well-oiled siege tower. And of course, Craterus, who handled logistics with the intensity of a man organizing the world's most dangerous picnic. Each general had a specialty. Some led charges, others built bridges, literally and figuratively, and some managed supplies like ancient accountants. What united them? A shared belief that teamwork and yelling in perfect formation wins wars. With Alexander as the showman and his generals as the choreographers, every battle felt less like chaos and more like a dance. A very deadly, sweaty, and occasionally dusty dance.
While Alexander was out conquering the world, someone had to make sure the empire didn't go bankrupt or collapse into chaos. Enter the unsung heroes of the Macedonian administration, tax collectors and bureaucrats. Behind every glorious battle was a less glamorous but crucial system of ledgers, scrolls, and tax forms, probably written in triplicate. Philip II had already laid the groundwork by organizing land surveys and establishing predictable taxes, just enough to fund an army, but not enough to spark a peasant revolt, usually. Alexander took it further, blending local governance with Greek oversight. Satraps were kept in check by royal inspectors. Think of them as ancient auditors with spears. Temples helped manage finances, acting like banks with divine customer service. And if you wanted to dodge taxes, good luck. The Macedonians had a knack for finding out who owed what, even if you were hiding in the mountains. Efficient, adaptable, and sometimes terrifying, their tax and govern model helped hold a massive empire together with the glue of gold, grain, and bureaucracy.
Alexander the Great wasn't just conquering lands, he was collecting cultural outfits like a historical fashion influencer. After defeating the Persians, instead of imposing Greek customs everywhere, Alexander did something shocking. He embraced local traditions. He wore Persian robes, very flowy, performed Eastern rituals, lots of incense, and even married Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria. His court became a blend of East and West, where Macedonian officers shared banquets with Persian nobles. Awkward at first, but the wine helped. Alexander's approach was less, we rule you now, and more, let's be stylish overlords together. This tactic of cultural fusion wasn't just diplomatic, it was practical. By respecting local customs, he gained loyalty without constantly waving swords around. While some Macedonians grumbled about losing their identity, Alexander was too busy setting wedding trends and blending cultures to care. The result? A more unified empire where sarissas met turbans and olive oil met curry spices. World domination with a side of multiculturalism. Alexander the Great didn't just conquer territories, he also left behind little souvenirs in the form of cities, dozens of them. And most of them had a very creative name, Alexandria. From Egypt to Central Asia, it was like he was playing an ancient version of Sim City, but with one default city name. Each Alexandria wasn't just a dot on the map, but a strategic hub for culture, military, and trade. Soldiers turned into settlers, markets buzzed with goods from every corner of the empire, and Greek theaters popped up next to Persian temples. The most famous one? Alexandria in Egypt, basically the Manhattan of the ancient world, minus the traffic jams. It had a lighthouse so big it was one of the seven wonders. Alexander's urban legacy wasn't just about architecture. It was about connecting people across continents, making sure even in the farthest desert, you could still find a plate of olives and someone arguing about Plato. City planning, Macedonian style.
In the grand Macedonian Empire, women weren't just background characters. Sure, some were married off like royal chess pieces, one political alliance at a time, but others? They wielded real influence behind silk curtains and marble walls. Take Olympias, Alexander's mom. She didn't just raise a world conqueror, she also stirred palace politics like a veteran soap opera character, complete with snakes. Macedonian women could own land, manage estates, and if they were royal, boss around generals, gently of course. In the royal court, their words mattered, especially if whispered into the right ears. Some even advised kings, others plotted their downfall. Equal opportunity, really. While they didn't march in the phalanx, their role in the social and political web was as sharp as any sarissa. In short, don't mess with a Macedonian lady in a chiton. She might not stab you, but she knows someone who will.
In the spiritual realm of the Macedonian Empire, gods were more than just statues collecting dust in temples. They were a dynamic social network of divine influencers. The Macedonians, inheriting Greek traditions, worshipped the usual A-listers: Zeus, Athena, Apollo. But Alexander, being the overachiever he was, decided his empire needed a divine rebranding. Enter Ammon, the Egyptian god with a ram's horns and major local clout. After a dramatic desert pilgrimage to the Siwa oasis, Alexander not only met the oracle of Ammon, but walked away convinced he was the god's son. Divine nepotism? Possibly. Smart PR? Definitely. This fusion of Eastern and Western deities wasn't just for show. It helped Alexander win hearts and taxes across cultures. Macedonian temples began looking more multicultural than a UN summit. Whether you believed Alexander was the son of Zeus, Ammon, or just really good at cosplay, one thing was clear. Religion in the empire wasn't about dogma, it was about diplomacy.
Trade under Alexander the Great wasn't just a side quest. It was the main storyline for a multicultural empire. As his army marched from Europe to Asia, they didn't just leave behind footprints, they left markets, warehouses, and lots of bargaining. From Greek olive oil to Persian carpets, from Egyptian glass to Indian spices, the Macedonian trade routes became the ancient version of Amazon Prime, minus the 2-day shipping. Greek became the common language of trade, which meant that whether you were haggling in Babylon or bartering in Bactria, a few well-placed opas might get you a discount. Alexander didn't just conquer territory, he connected economies, making cultural exchange a natural byproduct. Soldiers brought home silks instead of just scars, and merchants returned with both profit and proverbs. The result? A sprawling network of goods and ideas, with the scent of incense and fresh philosophy wafting through every market stall.
When Alexander the Great wasn't busy redrawing maps or negotiating with elephants in India, he was also inspiring a rather ambitious home decor trend. The architecture under his reign blended the Stoic columns of Greece with the vibrant curves and ornamentation of the East. Temples looked like philosophical debates in stone, while palaces resembled a cultural mashup party with marble floors and Persian rugs. The art followed suit. Statues got more expressive, hello dramatic cheekbones, and mosaics more colorful than a toga at Mardi Gras. Alexander's cities, especially those named after him, because modesty wasn't his strong suit, became hubs of experimental design. Think Greek gods painted with Egyptian eyeliner or courtyards echoing Babylonian ziggurat vibes. Macedonian art and architecture weren't just about aesthetics, they were strategic. By embracing local styles, Alexander won hearts while building some very Instagrammable skylines. 2,000 years too early. As Alexander's empire ballooned across continents, it faced a classic empire dilemma. Who's going to keep all these provinces from turning into neighborhood bake-offs or civil wars? Enter the new administrative class. Alexander cleverly combined local elites with loyal Macedonian officers, sprinkled in some Greek schooling, and voila, a new breed of bureaucrats was born. These officials, dressed in a mashup of togas and regional attire, managed taxes, disputes, and the occasional goat theft. Governors, or satraps, were assigned like toppings on a pita, just enough to flavor but not overpower. The scribes, with scrolls longer than Alexander's to-do list, recorded everything from grain counts to royal gossip. This fusion bureaucracy wasn't perfect, but it worked, until it didn't. Still, Alexander's experiment with hybrid governance was a masterclass in admin flair, with a side of cultural diplomacy and organizational acrobatics. After Alexander the Great's dramatic exit from history, his empire faced a classic problem. No sequel cast could match the original. His successors, known as the Diadochi, were less visionary conquerors and more competitive co-workers at a really dysfunctional office. Instead of uniting the empire, they played a very expensive game of Risk, with real swords and real grudges. The sprawling empire was sliced like a giant baklava, one piece for Seleucus, another for Ptolemy, and so on. As for Macedonia, it became less of a global superpower and more of a nostalgic souvenir. The central authority weakened, while power shifted to ambitious generals and regional governors. Without Alexander's charisma and military genius to keep the chaos in check, the once mighty empire became a noisy family dinner. Everyone shouting, no one listening, and someone inevitably flipping the table. Welcome to the beginning of the end. With the empire shattered into snack-sized kingdoms, Macedonia was no longer the star of the ancient geopolitical show. Instead of global domination, it returned to being a modest regional kingdom, like a retired rock star playing local gigs. But even this scaled-down version faced constant pressure. Successor states like the Seleucid Empire and Ptolemaic Egypt flexed their muscles, while rising powers like Rome started to peek over the horizon. Macedonia, once the proud conqueror, now had to look over its shoulder at every banquet, treaty, or border skirmish. The mighty lion had turned into a house cat with identity issues. Internally, the kingdom struggled to maintain unity, and externally, it was squeezed tighter than a soldier's bronze cuirass after a feast. Once the boss of everyone, Macedonia was now just another player on a very crowded and very competitive stage, and not even a top-billing one. After Alexander's empire splintered, the Game of Thrones kicked off with full drama. Macedonia's throne became a revolving door for ambitious kings like Cassander, the I'm totally legit ruler, Demetrius, the party-loving conqueror who sometimes forgot to govern, and Philip V, who genuinely tried, bless him. Each one had to juggle internal rebellions, paranoid nobles, and neighbors who saw the throne as an open mic night for conquest. Assassinations, betrayals, and surprise successions were as common as olive oil at dinner. Instead of unifying the kingdom, these leaders often created more chaos, leaving the royal palace more like a stage for a tragicomedy than a seat of power. While some had military flair or reformist ambition, none could restore the Golden Age. It was less about ruling an empire and more about surviving the next coup. Power in Macedonia had become a game of musical chairs, except the music was mostly shouting and the chairs had swords stuck in them.
In the post-Alexander era, some Macedonian kings suddenly rediscovered their appetite for conquest. Inspired by nostalgic murals of Dad's glory days, they dreamed of expanding borders once more. The problem? No one else shared their enthusiasm. The nobles were too busy counting taxes, the commoners just wanted a break from military drills, and the economy screamed, "Not this again." Without a clear long-term strategy or unified national support, these expansion efforts felt more like spontaneous road trips, ambitious but poorly planned. They launched campaigns that looked good on paper, but fell apart faster than a sandcastle in a rainstorm, with generals arguing over tactics and supply chains collapsing mid-battle, Macedonian ambition turned into a series of costly oopsies. The throne had vision, but the rest of the kingdom had a headache. Turns out, running an empire isn't just about yelling, "Charge," especially when no one behind you moves.
Macedonia's government, once a well-oiled war machine, started sounding more like a leaky cart on a muddy road. Corruption wormed its way into every crack. Bribes weren't just expected, they were practically on the menu. Officials became experts in pocket-filling rather than state-building. Meanwhile, the treasury kept throwing coins into military spending like a gambler on a losing streak. Castles needed guards, borders needed expansion, and kings needed shiny new helmets. But while the military budget ballooned, the economy just stayed the same. Trade slowed, taxes soared, and inflation made buying a loaf of bread feel like bidding at an auction. With no meaningful reforms and a government more interested in gossip than governance, the Macedonian administration was slowly crumbling. The empire didn't collapse with a bang, it just slouched into mediocrity, one mismanaged coin at a time.
Macedonia's society began splitting at the seams, not with swords but with silver spoons. The noble class, living like wine-tasting philosophers on marble balconies, grew more distant from the peasants trudging through muddy fields. While aristocrats hosted grand feasts, where grapes were peeled by handmaids, the farmers were busy peeling blisters from tax duty and endless military conscription. The rich wore silk, the poor wore worry. To make matters worse, nobles treated taxes like a fun hobby, one where only others played. The peasants, meanwhile, bore the burden of both grain and guilt. Discontent simmered like stew on a slow fire. The countryside murmured with complaints, but the palace only heard music. It was a tale of two Macedonias, one gilded in luxury, the other blistered in toil. And as the gap widened, unity crumbled. Not with a bang, but a yawn from the noble's lounging couch. As Macedonia's grip loosened, the Greek city-states, especially Athens and Sparta, started acting like rebellious teens who had just discovered philosophy and pitchforks. Athens, once the drama queen of democracy, began stirring protests with impassioned speeches and rolled-up scrolls of complaints. Meanwhile, Sparta didn't talk much. They never did, but their spears did plenty of talking. These city-states had been under Macedonian thumb long enough, and now that the thumb was tired, they started pushing back. Uprisings flared like olive oil on a hot pan. Macedonian governors sent letters back home with phrases like "situation under control," which usually meant everything is on fire. The army tried to stomp out revolts, but chasing down angry philosophers and javelin-throwing gym rats wasn't exactly glorious conquest. Macedonia, once feared as the unshakable overlord, was now playing a frantic game of political whack-a-mole.
Once the proud terror of the ancient world, Macedonia was now more like the used-to-be-cool uncle at a family gathering, still dressed in military glory, but no one really listens anymore. The days of Philip II and Alexander the Great were long gone, and their reputation faded faster than a toga left in the sun. Foreign envoys used to bow. Now they just nodded politely and moved on to more relevant superpowers. Alliances that once begged for Macedonian support now ghosted their messengers. In international summits, if such things existed, Macedonia probably sat at the kids' table. Even their cultural export of Greek language and customs was being overshadowed by rising powers. The empire that had once conquered from Greece to India was reduced to grumbling about back-in-my-day stories. The world had moved on, and Macedonia, well, it forgot to update its resume.
Once the backbone of Macedonian dominance, the army now resembled a tired troop more suited for parade than battlefield. The legendary phalanx, still around, but the spears were a bit wobbly, and half the soldiers were either too old, too drunk, or both. Recruitment had become a nightmare. Nobody wanted to fight for a fading kingdom. So Macedonia turned to mercenaries, hired swords with impressive muscles, but loyalty thinner than a wet papyrus scroll. Morale? Let's just say if battle cries were powered by enthusiasm, the Macedonians would have whispered their way to defeat. Training camps looked more like lazy picnics, and drills ended early for strategic naps. With no strong leadership and even weaker motivation, the once invincible army became a historical footnote waiting to happen. Enemies no longer feared them, they just budgeted time for a short scuffle before victory.
While Macedonia was busy unraveling itself with infighting, lazy generals, and confused policies, a new power was quietly flexing its muscles across the Adriatic Sea. Enter the Roman Republic, young, ambitious, and annoyingly organized. Unlike the chaotic courts of Macedonia, Rome had a senate that actually did things, roads that led somewhere, and soldiers who didn't nap during training. The Romans began eyeing the Balkans the way a cat eyes a distracted bird. Strategic alliances? Check. Military advisors posing as diplomats? Double check. Macedonia, too busy arguing over wine taxes and parade routes, didn't quite notice the looming Roman interest. By the time they realized Rome wasn't just another nosy neighbor, it was too late. The empire had already placed a bookmark in Balkan history, ready to write its next chapter. Spoiler alert, it wasn't going to be in Macedonian handwriting.
While Macedonia was stuck debating who spilled the royal wine, Rome was busy conquering the Italian peninsula. Step by step, town by town, and sometimes by very persuasive sword-point diplomacy. What started as a city-state of ambitious farmers turned into a rising juggernaut of military efficiency and bureaucratic obsession. They didn't just fight well, they taxed well, paved roads with flair, and even had standardized helmets. Soon, neighboring kingdoms began to feel a bit nervous. Rome's influence spread like olive oil on warm bread, smooth, relentless, and hard to resist. While Greek philosophers argued over metaphysics, Roman soldiers practiced how to outflank phalanxes. As Macedonia's political squabbles grew messier, Rome's Senate grew bolder. The Mediterranean, once a Greek playground, now had a new player, one who brought legions instead of liars. And they were just warming up. The First Macedonian War, 215-205 BCE, kicked off like a badly timed party. Philip V of Macedonia thought it was the perfect moment to expand his influence, especially since Rome was busy fighting Hannibal in Italy. So Philip did what any ambitious king would do. He teamed up with Rome's enemy, the Carthaginians. Bad move. Rome, even while juggling elephants and legions in Italy, still found time to give Philip a proper warning shot. Naval battles flared, Greek city-states chose sides, usually the losing ones, and by the end, Philip was left with a bruised ego and no new lands. The war didn't have a grand climax, more like an awkward breakup over messenger pigeons. But it sent a clear message. Rome didn't like sharing the playground, and especially not with kings who tried to be clever during Rome's lunch break. After licking his wounds from the First Macedonian War, Philip V wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. Like a boxer who swears he slipped, Philip tried to regain his old swagger. He reorganized his army, polished his throne, and even practiced his royal speeches in front of the mirror. But there was a tiny problem. Rome wasn't buying it, and neither were many of his Greek neighbors, who were starting to treat him more like a nosy uncle than a mighty king. Every attempt to flex his power was met with suspicious side eyes or open resistance. Worse, even his allies started asking, "So, you sure this guy knows what he's doing?" In a world where alliances were as stable as a three-legged stool, Philip found himself playing a very lonely game of chess, surrounded by impatient spectators and a growing Roman shadow creeping ever closer. By 200 BCE, Rome decided it had enough of Macedonia's antics. With the confident swagger of a self-appointed world police, Rome marched into Greece, not as invaders, of course, but as liberators. At least that's what the PR team said. The Second Macedonian War kicked off with Rome declaring they were freeing the Greek city-states from Macedonian tyranny. The Greeks, understandably confused, asked, "Wait, weren't you just minding your business across the Adriatic?" But Rome had a plan: weaken Philip V, make friends with disgruntled Greek allies, and plant the Roman flag, figuratively for now. Macedonian forces scrambled to respond, but it was clear they were dealing with a new kind of opponent. Disciplined, relentless, and excellent at dramatic speeches in the Senate. The liberation was off to a marching start, with trumpets, sandals, and lots of paperwork.
In 197 BCE, at the foggy hills of Cynocephalae, Rome and Macedonia finally clashed for real. On one side, the Macedonian phalanx, massive walls of spears, looking like a hedgehog with anger issues. On the other side, Roman legions, flexible, disciplined, and surprisingly good at flanking. The battle started as a chaotic mess: fog, shouting, horns, and people tripping over sandals. But soon, Roman adaptability shone. While the Macedonian phalanx pushed ahead in one half, their other side lagged behind. Classic teamwork issues. The Romans saw the gap, grinned, probably, and sliced right in. It was a turning point. The mighty Macedonian formation, once unbeatable, was outmaneuvered by quick footwork and even quicker thinking. Rome didn't just win a battle, they humiliated the legend. Phalanx, more like phalanx now.
After Philip V's defeat at Cynocephalae, his son Perseus stepped up, armed with ambition, a decent beard, and a serious desire to restore Macedonia's glory. Unfortunately, what he lacked was timing. While Perseus tried to rally the nobles and rebuild the army, Rome was already watching like a hawk eyeing its lunch. Perseus did make some smart moves, like diplomatic marriages, military drills, and even reforms to reduce corruption. Gasp! But Rome wasn't impressed. To them, Perseus was just the final boss before the credits rolled. He tried to play the old political game, courting Greek allies, but many preferred the Roman peace, or at least the Roman wine. Still, for a short while, Perseus made Macedonia feel proud again, until reality knocked on the door with a red Roman plume. By 171 BCE, Rome and Macedonia were once again ready to tango. But this time, it was less a dance and more a 3-year headbutt known as the Third Macedonian War. Perseus, now the main man of Macedonia, gave it one last heroic and somewhat desperate try. He reorganized the army, called in all favors, and even tried to charm some Greek states into siding with him. Spoiler alert, most said, thanks, but no thanks. Rome, now a muscular juggernaut, rolled in with disciplined legions and more political swagger than ever. The war dragged on with skirmishes, ambushes, and awkward diplomatic dinners. Macedonia gave it their all. Well, at least most of the time. But Rome wasn't interested in another draw. They wanted the sequel to end with fireworks, and they were getting ready to light the fuse. In 168 BCE, the Macedonian dream met its dramatic finale at the Battle of Pydna. Perseus, holding on to the last threads of hope, and probably a half-finished battle plan, faced off against Lucius Aemilius Paulus and his Roman legions. The Macedonian phalanx lined up like a wall of spears. Impressive, but, well, a bit too stiff. The Romans, with their flexible formations and sneaky maneuvers, danced circles around them. It wasn't just a battle. It was a masterclass in tactical evolution. The once mighty Macedonian army got sliced and diced like a salad at a Roman banquet. Perseus fled, only to be captured later, probably still wondering how things fell apart so fast. With this crushing defeat, the Antigonid dynasty officially went out, not with a bang, but with a very Roman boot to the face. After crushing Perseus at Pydna, the Romans didn't throw a big party. Well, maybe just a small victory wine toast. Instead, they rolled up their sleeves and got down to the real business: political dismantling. Macedonia was chopped up into 4 semi-autonomous regions, each with its own puppet council and an impressive set of new rules. Trade between them? Forbidden. Unity? Absolutely not. Basically, Rome handed them a big "do not collaborate" sticker and walked away with a smirk. The once mighty kingdom now looked like a group project where every member had a different deadline. It was a textbook case of divide and conquer, and Rome was the smug professor. Meanwhile, Macedonian nobles stared blankly at maps, wondering which border they just crossed by walking 5 steps. With no trade, no cohesion, and no clue, Macedonia was being prepped for its final act as a Roman province. Just when the Romans thought Macedonia was finally quiet, boom, surprise twist. a man named Andriscus popped up, waving his sword and claiming, "Hey everyone, I'm Philip VI, the rightful king." Spoiler, he wasn't. He was actually a former fuller, yes, laundry guy, with a dramatic flair and a questionable beard. Somehow, he managed to gather a few loyal followers, stir up some rebellion, and temporarily cause chaos in the Roman plans. For a hot minute, it seemed like Macedonia might break free. But Rome, never a fan of plot twists, quickly sent in an army to squash the rebellion. Andriscus was captured, probably still shouting royal catchphrases, and dragged to Rome in chains. And just like that, the curtain fell on the last gasp of Macedonian independence. In 146 BCE, Macedonia was officially turned into a Roman province. No more rebellions, no more fake kings, just tax collectors and Latin lessons.
And just like that, curtain closed. The mighty Macedonian monarchy, which once sent shivers down the spines of Persia and beyond, officially kicked the historical bucket. After the defeat of Perseus and the hilarious misadventure of fake King Andriscus, there were no more royal comebacks or dramatic last stands. The Antigonid dynasty, the final branch of Alexander the Great's legacy, was chopped off like a dry twig. What followed was silence. No more court intrigue, no more royal decrees shouted from balconies, just Roman administrators with scrolls and tax forms. Citizens of Macedonia blinked as they realized their kings had been replaced by guys in togas with clipboards. The age of Macedonian supremacy was over. From phalanx to paperwork, the transition was complete. And somewhere in the afterlife, Alexander probably did a dramatic facepalm.
Even as the Macedonian monarchy vanished into the footnotes of history, its cultural fingerprint stubbornly lingered, especially on its conquerors. The Romans, while busy stamping their eagle insignia everywhere, couldn't resist borrowing a few things. Greek language? Adopted. Architecture with columns that scream, "Look at me." Borrowed. Philosophy? Imported wholesale, along with statues that always forgot to wear pants. And who could blame them? Macedonian and Greek culture had flair, symphonies of thought, aesthetics, and dramatic hand gestures. Roman elites began sending their kids to Greek tutors, as if Plato himself were handing out report cards. Public forums echoed with Greek drama and ideas, blending swords and scrolls in a strangely elegant mix. Though the Antigonid dynasty was gone, its influence quietly slipped into Roman veins, ensuring that Macedonia didn't go down without leaving glitter in the cultural bloodstream. As the last Macedonian kings vanished into history books and Roman boots stomped firmly across the Balkans, a new chapter of world domination began. Not with a thunderous battle cry, but with Rome's signature efficiency and bureaucracy. From the ashes of Macedonia's fractured monarchy, Rome didn't just emerge, it strutted onto the world stage with aqueducts, senators, and a growing appetite for empire. While the Macedonians had once marched eastward with dreams of Persia, the Romans looked west, east, and everywhere in between, determined to pave roads over anyone in their path. Ironically, many Roman generals idolized Alexander, copying his tactics, reading his biographies, and even naming their horses after him. Macedonia had fallen, but its ghost lived on, in Roman tactics, military reforms, and even hairstyles. The world had a new superpower now, one with less poetry, more paperwork, but no less ambition. Rome was ready to build an empire that would outlast even the dreams of Philip and Alexander, and it all began in the ruins of a once proud kingdom. Centuries after his death, Alexander the Great still had a fan club, and not just any fans. Think emperors, generals, and world conquerors. From Rome to Renaissance Europe, rulers lined up to copy his style, his swagger, and most importantly, his conquest resume. Alexander wasn't just a king, he was the blueprint. His blend of military genius and personal charisma made him the measuring stick for greatness. Julius Caesar reportedly wept upon seeing Alexander's statue, lamenting that he hadn't achieved nearly as much by the same age. Napoleon? He didn't just admire Alexander, he traveled with biographies of him like they were sacred scrolls. Even medieval warlords whispered his name like a magic spell. Alexander didn't need social media to go viral. His legend did all the work. The dream of building a global empire, uniting East and West, and riding into battle like a demigod? That all traced back to one young Macedonian who refused to stop marching. If imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, then Alexander has been flattered nonstop for over 2,000 years. For Julius Caesar and Augustus, Alexander the Great wasn't just a historical figure. He was a life goal. Caesar, ever the ambitious Roman, was famously said to have broken down in tears after visiting a statue of Alexander in Spain, devastated that he had accomplished so little by the same age. Talk about ancient FOMO. Augustus, Caesar's successor and Rome's first emperor, also held Alexander in divine regard. He allegedly visited Alexander's tomb in Alexandria, laying flowers and marveling at his preserved body, like a devoted fan at a rock star's grave. For these Roman titans, Alexander was the gold standard of conquest, charisma, and immortal legacy. His blend of military genius and cultural impact was something even the mighty Caesars could only hope to imitate. And if you thought modern politicians had ego issues, just imagine two emperors trying to outdo a man who conquered half the known world by the time he could barely grow a full beard. While most generals carried maps and swords, Napoleon Bonaparte carried a biography of Alexander the Great everywhere. It wasn't just a light read for quiet evenings. It was his motivational handbook, war manual, and bedtime story all rolled into one. Napoleon idolized Alexander to the point of obsession. He saw in him not just a conqueror, but a fellow visionary with a taste for glory, ambition, and dramatic battlefield entrances. During campaigns across Europe and beyond, Napoleon reportedly consulted the life of Alexander for inspiration, like a student cramming before a world domination exam. From battlefield tactics to the idea of reshaping empires, Napoleon walked in Alexander's shadow, albeit with a better tailor. Though separated by centuries and geography, both men shared an uncanny belief that the world wasn't big enough for their dreams. And while one fell to illness and the other to exile, both left behind legacies that kept historians and artists very busy for centuries. Centuries may pass, but some battlefield tactics never go out of style. The military innovations of Philip II and Alexander the Great have been studied, dissected, and even reenacted in classrooms and war colleges all the way into the 21st century. The famed Macedonian phalanx, rows of disciplined soldiers wielding absurdly long spears, remains a textbook example of coordination and brute force. Philip may have invented it, but Alexander made it legendary, mixing it with cavalry, ambushes, and dazzling maneuvers that made ancient enemies dizzy and modern generals envious. From the Roman legions to Napoleonic strategies, echoes of Macedonian warfare live on. Even today, military academies analyze their campaigns with laser pointers and animated PowerPoints, proving that Alexander's genius still commands the room, even if the students now wear glasses instead of helmets. Turns out, charging headfirst into Persia with bold plans and a really long spear, still considered bold, just with fewer horses and more spreadsheets. Alexander the Great wasn't just a conqueror of lands, he was a city builder with a flair for branding. Wherever his army marched, a new Alexandria seemed to pop up like a franchise chain of ancient civilization. In total, over 20 cities bore his name. But the crown jewel was Alexandria in Egypt. This city wasn't just another military outpost. It became a bustling hub of culture, science, and philosophy for centuries. Home to the legendary Library of Alexandria and a massive lighthouse, because why not? It attracted scholars, traders, and thinkers from across the known world. Alexander may have departed this life early, but his urban planning career lived on impressively. Each Alexandria served as a mini Macedonian outpost, where Greek language, art, and ideas spread like wildfire. It's safe to say Alexander left behind more than just a body count. He left behind a cityscape that still echoes his ambition. Imagine conquering half the world and also being the reason people argue over which Alexandria they're talking about. Alexander may have conquered with swords, but his true legacy spread with scrolls, statues, and sandals. The cultural wave he launched, known today as Hellenization, didn't just stay in Greece. It surged across the Middle East, Central Asia, and even deep into India, like a philosophical tsunami. Greek theaters popped up next to Persian temples. Statues of Apollo stood in Bactria. And in places where no one spoke Greek before, suddenly people were discussing Plato over pomegranate juice. Cities built or influenced by Alexander became cultural fusion hotspots, blending Greek thought with local traditions. From art and architecture to religion and fashion, the East-West mix created a hybrid civilization that confused grandmothers but excited philosophers. It wasn't just about conquest anymore. It was about style, drama, and spreading the Greek alphabet like it was the next big trend. Who knew that invading the world could also mean exporting togas, logic, and tragic plays?
Even after Alexander's empire shattered into successor kingdoms, his cultural momentum kept rolling like a well-oiled chariot. The rulers of these new realms, Ptolemies in Egypt, Seleucids in the Middle East, and others, didn't just grab land. They embraced and expanded the Greek intellectual tradition. Philosophers debated under colonnades. Scientists experimented with steam-powered toys. Yes, really. And artists blended Greek forms with local styles. The Great Library of Alexandria became the ultimate brain hub of the ancient world, while schools of logic, geometry, astronomy, and medicine thrived from Egypt to Babylon. This explosion of thought, beauty, and curiosity planted the seeds for what would become Western civilization. From Euclid's geometry to Archimedes' floating bathtubs, it was a golden age of Hellenistic hustle. And to think, it all started because one young Macedonian couldn't sit still and stay home. Thanks, Alex.
Alexander the Great didn't just conquer kingdoms, he conquered pop culture too. Over the centuries, his story has been told and retold in every medium imaginable. Epic poems, dramatic plays, oil paintings, marble statues, novels, comic books, and yes, even Hollywood movies with over-gelled hair and suspicious accents. He's been depicted as a warrior, a philosopher, a demigod, and sometimes all three in one scene. From Renaissance canvases to modern movie posters, Alexander's image became the original influencer look. Flowing hair, piercing stare, and heroic poses on horseback. His life inspired myths, legends, and more screen time than most modern celebrities. Every era seems to remake him in its own style. Greeks saw him as a hero, Romans as a role model, Persians as a puzzle, and film directors as Oscar bait. Whether he's portrayed battling elephants or pondering destiny under starlight, one thing is clear. Alexander still has amazing PR, and no social media team.
Alexander the Great's legacy isn't just carved in marble, it's endlessly debated in classrooms, forums, and online comment sections. Was he a brilliant liberator who spread knowledge and culture, or a power-hungry conqueror with an ego the size of Persia? Depends who you ask. Western historians often praise his ambition, strategy, and influence on civilization. Meanwhile, some Eastern perspectives view him as a destructive invader who trampled over traditions, burned cities, and left chaos in his wake. To some, he's the enlightened bridge between East and West. To others, he's just the original guy who couldn't stop expanding his empire. Like any great historical figure, Alexander sits uncomfortably between hero and villain, with his sword in one hand and a philosophy scroll in the other. The truth? Probably somewhere in between, with a lot of dramatic flair on both sides. After all, history loves nuance, but documentaries love drama.
Alexander the Great may have died young, but his vision outlived empires. More than just territorial expansion, he dreamed of a world that blurred borders, connecting Asia, Europe, and Africa through culture, ideas, and trade. And strangely enough, he kind of pulled it off. His empire may have splintered, but the bridges he built, linguistic, artistic, intellectual, endured. Greek became a common tongue across continents. Scholars from Egypt debated with thinkers from India, and trade routes hummed with exotic goods and philosophical debates. Alexander didn't just redraw maps, he redrew mindsets. In a world once divided by language, tribe, and geography, he laid the foundation for something oddly modern. Globalism, ancient style. His true legacy wasn't in borders won or cities built. It was in the flow of knowledge, fusion of cultures, and a shared curiosity that spanned 3 continents. And all that from a guy who just wanted to go a little farther east.
In the quiet town of Vergina, archaeologists stumbled upon what may be one of the most astonishing tombs in ancient history, believed to be the final resting place of Philip II, father of Alexander the Great. Inside the burial chamber, a dazzling collection of treasures that would make even a pharaoh jealous. Golden armor, intricate crowns, ivory decorations, and a larnax, a fancy ancient box, said to hold royal bones. But this isn't just about glitter and gold. The tomb, untouched for centuries, gave historians a rare, unfiltered look into Macedonian royal rituals, funerary practices, and art. It was like opening a time capsule packed by people who really knew how to say, "We were important." Of course, some scholars still debate whether the tomb actually belonged to Philip II or another royal. But hey, when you find a solid gold wreath on a skeleton, someone big clearly lived and died there.
Of all the mysteries of the ancient world, one continues to baffle historians, archaeologists, and treasure hunters alike. Where on earth is Alexander the Great's tomb? Despite being one of history's most iconic figures, no one has definitively found his final resting place. Rumors place it in Alexandria, Egypt, naturally, but others suggest hidden chambers in Siwa Oasis, or even somewhere in modern-day Greece. Over the centuries, emperors, adventurers, and scholars have searched for it with more drama than a Netflix thriller. There are accounts of people visiting his tomb in antiquity, but it seemingly vanished from history like a magician's trick. Today it remains one of the greatest unsolved archaeological mysteries, mixing fact, legend, and a fair dose of wishful thinking. Wherever Alexander may be, one thing's for sure: he knows how to make an exit. Leaving behind an empire is impressive, but disappearing with style, now that's legacy. Before the glories of Alexandria, there was Pella, the original capital of Macedonia and the childhood home of Alexander the Great. Today, Pella may not have the same star power, but for archaeologists and history nerds, it's a goldmine with columns. Excavations have revealed grand palaces, public buildings, and floor mosaics so detailed you'd think someone invented pixel art in the 4th century BCE. These ancient tiles depict dramatic myths, fierce animals, and stylish chariot races, basically ancient Greek soap operas. More than just pretty pictures, the layout of Pella shows a city planned with surprising sophistication. Grid systems, plumbing, marketplaces, and even something resembling zoning laws. Visiting Pella is like walking through the blueprints of an empire in the making. And as every guide will gleefully remind you, this is where little Alexander probably threw his first spear, or broke his first vase. Either way, it all started here. If you thought the ruins of Alexandria were limited to dusty libraries and lost scrolls, think again. Beneath the sands of Egypt and the waves of the Mediterranean lie the sunken secrets of one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Once a glittering jewel of Alexander's vision, modern archaeologists are still uncovering pieces of the original Alexandria, bit by fascinating bit. Temples, statues, streets, and even parts of the fabled royal quarters have been found underwater, thanks to earthquakes, tsunamis, and the city's dramatic flair for disappearing acts. Divers with high-tech gear now swim through submerged columns, while researchers debate over whether this block belonged to Cleopatra's palace or just an ancient seafood market. Every discovery adds another layer to the legend, a reminder that even when a city sinks, its story refuses to stay buried. Clearly, Alexandria took the phrase "depth of history" very literally. You know you've made it as a conqueror when your name becomes a city, and Alexander the Great made it into over 20 of them. From Egypt to Pakistan, the name Alexandria litters ancient maps like a self-promotional world tour. Each city was more than just a glorified souvenir stand. They were key outposts of trade, military control, and naturally Greek culture, cuisine, and gossip. While not all these Alexandrias stood the test of time, their locations reveal just how far his influence stretched. Imagine traveling the ancient Silk Road and stopping at Alexandria. Again, and again, and again. Some of these cities evolved into major hubs, while others faded into forgotten desert dots. But they all scream one thing: branding. Alexander didn't just conquer territory, he conquered Google Maps before it was cool. Turns out the ultimate legacy might just be real estate. Today, if you stroll into a European museum, whether in Paris, London, or Berlin, you might stumble upon a golden helmet, a jewel-encrusted dagger, or a cracked papyrus scroll from ancient Macedonia. These artifacts, some displayed behind thick glass with motion sensors because touching is strictly for archaeologists, tell stories of war, royalty, and everyday life in Alexander's world. From Philip II's ceremonial armor to coins stamped with Alexander's face, still more flattering than most modern ID photos, European collections hold treasures looted, gifted, or borrowed indefinitely during past centuries. While some scholars debate the ethics of such collections, others are just thrilled to see Macedonian sandals surviving longer than their own sneakers. These relics serve as cultural time machines, reminding us that even empires reduced to dust can still sparkle under museum lights. You'd think ancient Greek culture stayed tucked away in Athens, but surprise, it's been partying all the way to Afghanistan and Iran. Recent archaeological digs in these regions have unearthed coins bearing Greek inscriptions, statues rocking togas, and even buildings with unmistakably Hellenistic flair. It's as if Alexander's army not only brought swords and shields, but also interior designers. These findings tell a wild story of cultural fusion. Greek gods meeting Eastern deities, local art adopting Greek drama poses, and marketplaces where olives and pomegranates likely argued over shelf space. One site in Afghanistan even revealed a sculpture of Hercules with a face more Central Asian than Mediterranean. Clearly, the Greek influence didn't fade at the edge of the empire, it just got a makeover. So next time someone says East and West don't mix, just point them to a Macedonian mosaic buried in the desert sands. Two countries, one name. Endless debates. The modern spat between Greece and North Macedonia over who gets to claim Alexander the Great as their own would make even ancient philosophers throw their scrolls in the air. Greece insists that Alexander was undeniably Greek. After all, he spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and had a thing for togas. North Macedonia, on the other hand, argues that their land was once part of the Macedonian kingdom. So hey, why not adopt the legacy? The debate spills into politics, textbooks, statues, and even Eurovision song contests. At one point, negotiations got so intense, they almost needed a diplomatic UN dance-off. Eventually, a compromise was reached. North Macedonia agreed to add North to its name, but the cultural tug-of-war, that's still going strong, especially whenever someone unveils a new statue of Alexander with suspiciously modern cheekbones. Once upon a classroom, Alexander the Great was a flawless hero, riding across deserts with perfect hair and conquering hearts and empires. But today's textbooks are a bit more complicated. In some, he's still the shining star of ancient glory, a boy wonder who reshaped the world map. In others, he's painted as a reckless conqueror with commitment issues and a penchant for burning cities. Educational systems across the world now wrestle with how to portray Macedonia's legacy. Is it a story of heroism or hubris? Of genius or imperial overreach? While some students swoon over tales of the Gordian knot, others raise eyebrows at the number of towns he flattened. Modern textbooks walk a tightrope between myth and history, trying to explain why Alexander is both a symbol of brilliance and a cautionary tale. Often in the same paragraph. The Macedonian Empire may have crumbled into the dust of history, but its echoes still thunder through time. Alexander the Great, whether as a statue, a meme, or a surprise answer on a trivia night, continues to stir awe and debate. From military academies dissecting his tactics to philosophy classes pondering his ambitions, the legend lives on, sharper than his sword and harder to ignore than his haircut. His empire might have fragmented faster than a poorly built IKEA shelf, but the cultural fusion he ignited still shapes art, language, and politics across continents. Macedonia's legacy is a curious cocktail of inspiration and cautionary tale. It reminds us that glory fades, but drama is eternal. And in that sense, Alexander may be the most successful influencer in history, 2,000 years later and still trending.